Picture this. An American tourist walks into a London bakery. There's no rope, no sign saying line starts here. Just a handful of people standing around, seemingly browsing pastries, checking their phones, examining the ceiling. The American thinks, great, no line, and marches confidently to the counter. The temperature in the room drops 5 degrees. What the American didn't realize is that they just committed one of Britain's most serious social crimes, queue jumping. Those people weren't randomly standing around, they were in an invisible, yet perfectly ordered queue. And everyone knew it, everyone except the American. This is the story of what happens when American directness collides with British order, when individualism meets the collective consciousness, and when "are you in line?" becomes the most anxiety-inducing question a British person can hear. To understand why Brits take queuing so seriously, we need to travel back in time. The orderly queue became an established social form in the early 19th century, arising from more urbanized, industrial societies that brought masses of people together. But it was World War II that truly cemented queuing as a national identity marker. During the war, rationing made queues essential to daily survival. Things that weren't rationed would go on sale spasmodically, word would go round, and long queues would start to form. People often joined queues without even knowing what they were queuing for, hoping it would be something useful. This necessity transformed into a cultural value. Queuing became synonymous with fairness, patience, and doing one's patriotic duty. Today, queuing is practically Britain's national sport. A 2023 YouGov survey revealed that 76% of Brits believe queue etiquette is a reflection of one's character. It's not just about waiting your turn, it's about who you are as a person. One of the most confusing aspects of British queuing culture is the invisible queue. The bar counter is the only place in England where anything is sold without the formation of a queue, yet there is in fact a queue, an invisible queue, and both the bar staff and customers are aware of each person's position in this queue. This concept extends beyond pubs. At bus stops, in train stations, even in casual social settings, Brits maintain a mental map of who arrived when. There are no velvet ropes or floor markers needed. The order exists in collective consciousness, enforced by an elaborate system of subtle glances, throat clearing, and passive-aggressive sighing. Reddit users have shared countless stories about this phenomenon. One particularly viral thread titled, "Do British people really queue like that?" garnered over 10,000 upvotes after an American tourist shared how they got cut off by a grandma who actually wasn't cutting, but just knew the invisible queuing hierarchy better. While British queuing is classical music, precise, structured, with everyone following the same sheet music, American queuing habits are more like jazz, improvised but functional. This isn't to say Americans don't queue. They absolutely do, but the approach is fundamentally different. In a 2023 survey, only 42% of Americans felt that queue etiquette reflected one's character, compared to 76% of Brits. This gap reveals a deeper cultural divide. Where Brits see queuing as a moral imperative, Americans view it more pragmatically, as a system to achieve efficiency rather than an expression of social values. Perhaps nothing captures the American queuing approach better than the phrase, "Are you in line?" This simple question, which seems perfectly reasonable to Americans, causes British people genuine anxiety. Why? Because in Britain, you're supposed to know who's in the queue. Asking reveals that you don't understand the invisible social contract. Americans may accidentally merge into a line, thinking it's just a crowd. This spatial efficiency mindset, if there's a self-checkout with no line, why wait? Makes perfect sense in American individualistic culture, but crashes spectacularly against British collective order. Regional differences exist too. Northerners like those from New York, Massachusetts, and New Jersey are known as line jumpers, while Southerners queue quite well, viewing queue jumping as acting like an entitled person who thinks they're better than others. British pubs are where American confusion reaches peak levels. Unlike almost everywhere else in Britain, pubs don't have physical queues. Yet getting served at a busy bar involves gradually easing yourself toward the front, being neither too meek nor too bold. The invisible queue at the pub bar operates on an elaborate code. Bar staff are remarkably skilled at identifying who is next in the invisible queue, and any obvious attempt to get served out of turn will be ignored by bar staff and frowned upon by other customers. Americans, used to more direct service, often commit critical errors. Waving money in the air? Mortifying. Calling out, "Excuse me," repeatedly? Queue jumping. Snapping fingers? Unforgivable. Taking the entire group to the bar? You're blocking others. Everyone standing at the bar, from patrons to bartender, all know in their heads who is next, so please don't snap your fingers, clap your hands, whistle, or yell out at the bartender. Your turn will come, and everyone knows when that is, even if you don't. One American tourist recounted their experience on a travel forum. "I stood at the bar for what felt like forever. I made eye contact with the bartender multiple times, but nothing. Finally, I waved my credit card, and suddenly I had to wait even longer." Later, a British friend explained I'd committed the cardinal sin of obvious queue jumping behavior. Supermarkets present another minefield. In America, you might ask someone browsing if they're in line. In Britain, that person is in line, they're just maintaining the proper British distance while being in the queue. The self-checkout area has become particularly problematic. Some British supermarkets are transitioning to single queue systems that feed to multiple checkouts, a system Americans understand. But others maintain the old free-for-all approach where you must mentally track who arrived when across multiple potential checkout points. Supermarket self-checkout queues have yet to conform to a norm, with some people standing there thinking the checkout on the right will be theirs next until they get the glare from the next person who is patiently queuing. Train stations combine all the worst queuing confusion into one high-stakes environment where missing the social cues could literally mean missing your train. Train etiquette expert William Hansen emphasizes, "Let others off the train before you try to get on and stand to the side of the train doors, neatly lining up on each side of the door in the order you arrived." Yet Americans often struggle with this. In U.S. cities, there's often a more aggressive boarding approach: get on quickly or get left behind. In Britain, this is seen as barbaric. One forum user noted, "I've often noticed that 'please allow passengers off the train first' is largely misheard by those on the platform as 'please swarm around the doors the second the train stops and leave a 2-inch gap for those who wish to alight.' The escalator rule adds another layer of complexity. In the UK, USA, and parts of Western Europe, passengers should adopt the stand on the right, move on the left practice. Americans coming from cities like New York understand this, but those from regions without extensive public transit systems often stand obliviously on the left, blocking the flow and earning withering British stares. Here's a story that perfectly captures British queue culture taken to its extreme. A garden center worker was walking through a packed greenhouse on a hot summer day, holding a water bottle and a bag of sweet. He was heading to open a new till after getting a call for help from his manager. The queues were long, customers were getting impatient, and they needed someone up front immediately. But before he could even reach the counter, a tall man with the build of a rugby player stepped directly in front of him and barked, "Quay, mate!" Back of the queue. The worker tried to explain that he wasn't cutting the line. He actually worked there and was called to help. He was literally going to open another till to serve everyone faster. But the man wouldn't listen. "Queue starts back there," he snapped again, waving his arm like a traffic warden. His face was red, his jaw set. Queue jumping was a serious offense, and he wasn't about to let anyone, violate the sacred British queue order. So the worker shrugged, said nothing, and calmly walked to the end of the line. Think about that for a moment. Rather than argue, rather than insist, rather than pull rank and say, "I work here, I need to get through," this worker chose the most British response possible: passive compliance with a side of poetic justice. 5 long, sweaty minutes later, he finally reached the register. He logged in, adjusted his uniform, smiled politely at the queue, and said in the most cheerful voice possible, "Next, please." The look on the rude customer's face was absolutely priceless. It went from red to white to purple in about 3 seconds. The crowd behind him started chuckling. Some openly laughed. The man couldn't disappear fast enough, slinking away in complete embarrassment. Everyone in that greenhouse had witnessed the most British form of revenge, letting someone's own stubbornness expose their foolishness. The worker didn't need to argue or prove himself. His quiet decision to join the queue let the truth unfold naturally and hilariously. This story illustrates a fascinating paradox about British queue culture. The customer thought he was standing up for fairness, enforcing the rules that keep society orderly. But by refusing to listen, by assuming rather than asking, he turned a simple situation into a comedy show for everyone watching. British queue etiquette is almost sacred. People take fairness seriously. But sometimes, sticking to rules without thinking can make you look foolish. The customer thought he was defending British values. In reality, he was enforcing the rule on the wrong person. Queuing is seen by some as antithetical to America's rampant individualism, where your place is often imagined as malleable rather than rigid, dependent on achievements, popularity, and wealth. In American culture, assertiveness is generally rewarded. Speaking up, taking initiative, and finding efficiencies are valued traits. British culture, conversely, places enormous value on knowing one's place within a social order. Like class, the English propensity to celebrate queuing illuminates a peculiar national obsession with order, hierarchy, and one's place within it. The queue is a microcosm of society, everyone equal, everyone waiting their turn, everyone aware of their position relative to others. For Brits, queuing represents fundamental fairness. First come, first served appeals to the British sense of fair play, something very close to their hearts. This principle is so important that Wimbledon's famous queue, where people camp for days to get tickets, even has its own code of conduct and dedicated fan sites celebrating the art of waiting. When Americans inadvertently jump the queue, they're not just breaking a social convention, they're violating a deeply held belief about fairness and social justice. When someone pushes in or kicks up a fuss about queuing, there is unrest and a sense of injustice against the rest of the queue. Americans tend to emphasize individualism and achievement, while British culture often leans into modesty and knowing your place. What Americans see as being confident, Brits might see as arrogant. This extends to queuing behavior. An American asking, "Are you in line?" is trying to communicate and clarify. A Brit would never need to ask because they've already mentally tracked everyone's position. Bus stops in Britain no longer have the orderly physical queues they once did, but passengers are expected to respect the amount of time people have waited. If there are people already at the bus stop and you turn up at the same time as the bus, it would be polite to let people who are already waiting onto the bus first. Americans, especially those from cities where bus boarding is more of a free-for-all, often board based on proximity to the door rather than arrival time. This causes silent fury among waiting Brits who've been mentally tracking the queue for the past 15 minutes. In London's trendy coffee shops, Americans often face the dreaded invisible queue scenario. People are standing around on their phones, leaning against walls, examining the pastry case. To an American, this looks like people who haven't decided yet or are waiting for friends. In reality, they're all in a queue. They're just maintaining proper British personal space, about an arm's length apart, and avoiding the awkwardness of standing in a tight, obvious line. Even in an area with no visible line, The British will instinctively know to start one. One Reddit user shared, "I went to a Pret in London. No line visible. I walked up to the counter and ordered. The person next to me said, very quietly, 'I believe you've jumped the queue.' I turned around and realized 5 people were spread out behind me, all looking at me like I'd murdered their grandmother." British post offices often use the single queue multiple server system, which Americans generally understand. But some smaller post offices still rely on the invisible queue method. Americans unused to this will walk in, see several people scattered around, and head straight for an open counter, only to be met with the British version of rage, pointed throat clearing and a coldly polite, "Excuse me, but I believe there's a queue." Passive-aggressive huffing is as strong a reprimand as shouting in British queuing behavior. When an American inadvertently jumps the queue, they may encounter several responses. The throat clear, a pointed ahem that conveys volumes of disapproval. The loud whisper, "Well, some people don't know how to queue." The pointed look, sustained eye contact that could freeze water. The martyred sigh, accompanied by eye rolling to other queue members. The polite but firm redirect, "I'm so sorry, I'm in the queue, you'll find the end over there." One American described their experience. "I thought the woman behind me was having an asthma attack from all the huffing and sighing. Turns out I just stepped slightly out of order when the line moved forward, and she was expressing her displeasure through respiratory distress." While most queue violations result in silent treatment or passive aggression, sometimes Brits do speak up. One forum commenter noted, "If you want to upset an Englishman, just push your way in front of him whilst he's queuing for his fish and chips." When they do confront, it's always couched in extreme politeness. "Excuse me, but I think you may have missed the queue," or "So sorry, but I believe I was here first." The words are polite, but the tone could cut glass. Despite the cultural confusion, Americans do bring some positive elements to the queuing dynamic. In American queuing there's more flexibility, conversation, and you-go-first moments, especially in places like Costco. This generosity of spirit, when properly channeled within British queue structure, can actually be quite charming. Americans are also more likely to help confused tourists, ask if someone needs to go ahead because they're in a hurry, or strike up friendly conversation while waiting. These behaviors, when done without violating queue position, are increasingly appreciated in modern British society. An interesting case study comes from the world of online queuing. A company called Crowd Handler discovered a fundamental difference between British and American expectations when selling concert tickets online. When Californians arrived at the appointed on-sale time, they found a fully formed line of people ahead of them who had arrived early, and despite following the rules, they had no chance of getting a ticket. The Americans were furious. To them, showing up at the stated time should mean everyone has an equal chance. To Brits, getting there early and queuing ahead of time was perfectly fair, first come, first served. The company had to completely redesign their system to accommodate both cultural expectations. For Americans visiting the UK, here are the survival strategies gleaned from countless cultural collision stories. Observe first. When you enter any British establishment, pause and observe. Look for patterns in how people are standing or waiting. Maintain proper distance. Stand an arm's length away from the person in front of you to avoid crowding, but not so far that someone might think there's room to jump in. When in doubt, ask about the end. If you're ever uncertain where to join a queue, simply ask, "Is this the end?" to find your spot. Never save spots. Holding a place for friends is frowned upon in the UK. If your friends want to join the queue, they should join from the back. Respect the invisible queue at bars. Watch who's already at the bar, make eye contact with the bartender but don't wave or yell, and wait patiently for your turn. Mind the escalator rule. Stand right, walk left. Always. Don't ask, "Are you in line?" This phrase causes British people existential anxiety. Instead, observe and take your place accordingly. The COVID-19 pandemic brought some interesting changes to British queuing culture. During COVID, when table service in pubs was mandatory, certain younger drinkers started forming orderly queues at bars, though this practice has largely faded. The pandemic also normalized marked floor positions in shops, making queues more visible and, ironically, more American in approach. Some Brits worry this has damaged the sacred art of the invisible queue. Younger generations, growing up with more explicit queue markings, may lack the finely tuned queue sense of their elders. Queues are now viral moments, from Wimbledon lines to viral TikToks. Queuing has become performance art. Americans documenting their queue-jumping mishaps on social media has created a whole genre of cross-cultural content, helping to educate future visitors while providing entertainment. In the grand debate of British versus American queuing, there is no true winner, just two nations separated by a common concept, waiting their turn. British queuing represents order, fairness, and collective consciousness. American queuing represents efficiency, flexibility, and individual agency. When these systems collide, in airport lounges, London pubs, and train stations across the UK, misunderstandings are inevitable. The American who cheerfully walks to the front, thinking there's no line, isn't being rude by their cultural standards. They simply haven't yet learned to see the invisible. The British response, the huffing, the glaring, the pointed throat clearing, isn't personal hatred. It's the sound of a deeply held cultural value being violated, the disruption of an unspoken social contract that's been generations in the making. For Americans visiting the UK, learning to queue British style is more than just following rules. It's an entry point into understanding a culture that values social order, respects hierarchy, and believes that patience truly is a virtue. It's recognizing that sometimes the most important lines are the ones you can't see. And for Brits encountering confused Americans, perhaps a little patience, which they should have plenty of, given all that queuing practice, and gentle guidance can help bridge the cultural divide. After all, everyone had to learn the invisible queue rules once. In the end, both systems work within their respective cultures. The key is recognizing that when you cross the Atlantic, you're not just changing time zones, you're entering a completely different queuing dimension. Master the queue, and you'll master British culture. Fail to queue properly and prepare for a lot of throat clearing in your future. The invisible queue may seem absurd to outsiders, but to the British, it's a sacred institution, a marker of civilization, and perhaps their greatest cultural contribution to the world, even if Americans can't see it.